All right, guys. So I'm going to be giving you a quick lecture on the resettlement process, at least here in the United States, for refugees and the myths surrounding refugees. So this will wrap up what the mini crash course we've taken on learning about refugees this unit. So let's get started. All right. So the first thing I think we need to ask ourselves is, what is resettlement? And resettlement is basically a careful selection of refugees from an asylum country, for example, Greece, to another country for the purpose of lawful admission and resettlement. So you would think that a lot of refugees would be resettled in any given year, but the last 5, 6 years, only 1% of refugees have been resettled every year out of the 23 million. So think of anywhere from 500,000 to just below a million. So the number is really low, and I'll give you the specific number that the United States takes in every year. And I think part of that also has to do with the fact that very few countries take part in the United Nations Refugee Resettlement Program. Canada, Germany, the UK, the US, Nordic countries are part of this list. And a lot of the third world, quote unquote, or developing countries are not really part of that. I mean, they are the ones that take in the refugees, such as Lebanon or Jordan, but they don't necessarily fall under the UNHCR's resettlement program. Okay, so this is the general process for resettlement in the United States. Now, looking at it, it might not make total sense because you see arrows there and a bunch of words and your mind immediately says no. But it's not that complex. If a refugee qualifies for resettlement, when they're in a refugee camp, for example, say in Jordan or Greece or Lebanon, there is an overseas process by potential host countries. So for example, if you're a refugee living in Lebanon, in a refugee camp, and you qualify for resettlement in the United States, you have an interview in Lebanon, and they basically ask you the questions, that you'd expect. What connections do you have to the country? In this case, the United States. Do you know of anybody who lives in the United States? Who are you? What's your story? So they do that, and they go into the country that you left. We could say Syria, for example, and they try to verify your story just to see if you say who you are. So it's a background check, basically. And interesting to say is that priority is given to those who do have a connection to the host country. So if you're in Lebanon in a refugee camp and you know somebody from the United States, chances are you'll qualify and you'll be let in. But being chosen for resettlement takes a long time. It takes anywhere from 18 to 36 months or even 4 years. It takes a really long time. And if you do qualify, you're given a flight, you go to the United States, and you start working with anywhere from 1 to 10 agencies. And these agencies are very specific, so I'm not going to tell you the name, but they work on integrating refugees to the country. So if a refugee comes into the United States, they qualify for resettlement, they're provided housing and basic needs from anywhere from 30 to 90 days. And the agencies basically help the refugees finding assistance, right? They're finding out how to live in this country. So finding permanent housing, work, finding a school to place, if they have kids, to place their kids at, how to live in the country, how to go grocery shopping, for example. That's one of the things that these agencies teach refugees. So basically getting integrated, right? Hence reintegration and resettlement. So they get a bunch of other types of aids here, but that's very specific. But anyways, this is the general process. But again, I want to remind you that only 1% of refugees are resettled every year. So out of the 23 million refugees in the world, 1% will probably experience this. Okay. So why is refugee resettlement important? And it's right there for you, right straight out of the UNHCR website. Resettlement is a life-saving solution for most vulnerable refugees in the world. It's an important way to share responsibility and support the developing countries that host the majority of the world's refugees. But there's a really, really bad disconnect here, because even though the United States, Germany, Nordic countries, Canada, the UK have this responsibility and take pride in their responsibility in helping refugees, or at least I think so, there is a big problem because most of the countries in these areas here, 80%, 85% of the world's refugees are being hosted in these countries, and a lot of them are staying there for most of the time. So look at this, 3.5 million in Turkey. And how many of them are going to be resettled? Well, what's 1% of 3.5 million? What, 30,000? So that's the strong disconnect there. Okay. Okay, here we are. So how many refugees does the United States actually accept? So in 1980, when the program was kind of solidified under President Ronald Reagan, it was about 200,000, and it's fluctuated since then. But under the current administration, presidential administration, in 2019, this number fell to 20,000. And I even read like 15,000 at one point. So the previous administration, 2015 and 2016, let in about 110,000. So Barack Obama. Under President Trump currently, we're seeing these numbers. And as you can see, it's very low compared to 1980 when it was 200,000. But we can't necessarily say it's any fault of the presidents in between these times or the administration, because it's really fluctuated with global events and priorities. So fear after 9/11, for example, it makes sense it would go down. Economy booming in the mid 2010s, going up. So there's that. All right. Let's talk about some myths behind refugees here. So there are a bunch of myths, I'm going to say, but I'm going to give you about 4 myths here that I think are valuable in knowing and busting them, so that in case you ever hear them, you've got something else to say and to argue. All right. So number 1, the process for admitting refugees to the United States is not secure and terrorists can easily enter the country. That is busted because the refugee resettlement process is the most difficult way to enter the United States illegally. Right? So entering as a refugee is the most difficult way of entering. As I said, in this chart all the way back here, okay, maybe that was actually a bad idea. That was not a bad, that was a bad idea. Here, let me see if I can find it. Here we are. So, letting it load. So, as you can see, the process is very complex here. If you remember overseas processing, then there's an agency that helps them out, initial placement, program placement, assistance. That can take about a year to do, a year to 2 years. So the myth that it's not secure and that terrorists can easily enter is completely bogus. So there's a big screening process and a lot of agencies involved. And just as a side note for you guys, people worry about terrorist attacks and all this fear we probably see in the news, but fact of the matter is, here's some cold hard statistics. The leading cause of death in the United States is from car crashes. So those of us living here and those of us that can drive, about 1 in 9,000 chance of dying. It's actually risen in the last 20 years, so 1 in 640. The equivalent rate of dying from a terrorist attack on American soil, however, since 2001, is about 1 in 12.6 million. So there you have it. It's more dangerous driving, and all this talk of refugees or newcomers into the country not being secure, that's thrown out the window. Number 2, the United States is the only country that takes in refugees. We do more than our share to help refugees, newcomers for that matter. That's busted because, like I said, there are a bunch of other countries that help in resettling refugees. 28, Canada, Australia, Norway, the UK, Sweden, Germany, so on and so on. But as I told you, the number of refugees who come into the United States is very low, 20,000. And compared to the 23 million, there's nothing to say there. But very few refugees are actually eligible for resettlement, so many of them aren't. Other refugees are forced to flee and seek safety in host countries, and these host countries that are taking in refugees, Turkey, for example, they're reaching their breaking point. And Lebanon, as another example, they currently host over 1 million refugees, and most of them are fleeing Syria because of the civil war going on, and that amounts to about 1 refugee for every 5 people in Lebanon. So this idea that the United States is doing the best it possibly can, that Australia, Canada, Norway, UK That's that's so far from the truth because Lebanon, Turkey, these host countries, they're taking in the refugees, but not necessarily resettling them because either they don't want to or can't afford it. All right, number three, refugees are a burden on receiving communities. That's not true because the primary goal of any refugee resettlement agency in the United States, at least, Canada too, is to help them become self-sufficient in their new home. So it's not like we take in the refugees and then we take care of them for 20, 30, basically the whole time they're here. No, the goal is that agencies who help out the government, the federal government, they're trying to make these refugees become self-sufficient so they can live here peacefully and do what they need to do. In addition to immigrants, so statistics here for you, in addition to immigrants, refugees are critical to economic growth. I read somewhere that it's estimated that immigration provides a net gain of $10 billion a year for the US economy. And also, several refugees who enter the country honestly have a high level of education and skills. A lot of them come in with master's degrees, a lot of them come in as electricians, a lot of them come in as teachers, a lot of them come in as, I don't know, professors, doctors, so on and so on. Now, finding jobs with those skills is a bit difficult, and the whole government setup isn't necessarily helping that cause. But this has been busted. Refugees are not a burden on receiving communities. Right? Number four, they don't pay taxes. That's busted because all newcomers, refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers, so on and so on, they pay taxes regardless of the lack of benefits they receive. So a lot of them don't even receive the benefits from the government, but still pay taxes. In Oregon, specifically, newcomers contributed up to $140 million in Social Security taxes per year. For Medicare, that's up to $33 million. So the economic benefit of newcomers and refugees is so strong. And I'll leave you this statistic just to think about. Over the last 10 years, refugees have contributed to over $65 billion to our economy. And this isn't counting other factors. So I think a good question to ask ourselves, now that we've learned about refugees, looked at them a little bit more, studied them, is asking ourselves, let me go to the slide here. Why exactly aren't we letting in refugees more than we should? Because if refugees have contributed to $65 billion, and if there have only been 3 cases out of the nearly 1 million refugees who have been led into the country's terrorist attacks, what exactly is the whole deal behind this low number? All right. So, what is our responsibility as a society? What is our responsibility as a country in helping refugees? The stats are there to look up. They're as clear as day. So, think about that. Anyways, I hope that the unit went well for you. I hope that it was good learning about refugees. Next week, we are going to be reviewing and taking a test, and that'll lead us into our last unit of the school year. So, if you have any questions, I'm always more than willing to help you find something and answer any questions. So, there you have it.